So this evening, we're going to hear from Rob Csernyik, Ashleigh Rae-Thomas, and David Kim-Cragg, all of whom contributed to the October-November 2023 issue of Broadview. And one final note before we begin, after our speakers have told us about themselves and their stories, there will be a time to ask questions. Sharon will post our instructions on how to ask questions in the chat space. I have some questions ready, but this is truly your time to talk with our writers, and we'll have a more vibrant conversation if there's lots of participation. So let's get started. Rob Csernyik is a freelance journalist specializing in business and investigative reporting, as well as long-form features. One of his areas of specialty is the gambling industry. His investigations into casinos in Nova Scotia have won him gold awards from Canada's Digital Publishing Awards and the Atlantic Journalism Awards. In our October-November issue, Rob wrote the story Gambling Problem, the cover story, and that was a feature that examines the explosion of online sports betting and the lack of any protest or outcry against it. Rob is beaming into us tonight from Australia, so I want everyone to give him a warm welcome. So welcome, Rob.
Thank you very much. It's actually the morning here, believe it or not. I'm coming to you from the future, and things look good. So I can get started, Jocelyn? Great. So thank you very much for the introduction and for joining us tonight. I wanted to talk just briefly about three things. First of all, just how I came to write about this topic. Secondly, I wanted to discuss some of the challenges behind the scenes in writing this story, and then also some of the important takeaways that I hope you were able to take from this piece. So I have done a lot of backward looking at gambling. So as we know, in the 1990s, casinos and BLTs started in Canada, and we had this big wave of gambling that had never been seen before. And obviously, there was a lot of fear back then that this was going to have very big impacts on Canadian society. And what's interesting about it is that back then, there was a lot of pushback from community groups, from religious denominations, small business owners, politicians, you name it. There were people speaking out against it, and very forcefully, I might add. And so what's interesting to me was looking back, for example, at just even in Nova Scotia, my home province, how things had changed over the years. Or I'm also working on a book about the casino industry, so I've looked at other areas as well. And there's been very clearly a change where early on there was a lot of concern, there was a lot of pushback, and then just over the years it declined. Now we're in the midst of a completely new wave of gambling, and this is multi-billion-dollar sports and online betting. Anyone who's a hockey fan or a sports fan, I'm sure, is more than familiar with the advertisements. And if you're not a sports fan, I'm sure you're equally familiar as well. And what's interesting, though, to note is that a lot of the pushback that once existed, that was related to community harms, the harms to families, the harms to individuals losing money, developing an addiction. And also the fact that, the government was playing a role in it because, casinos, sports books, et cetera, a lot of that here in Canada is owned by the government outright, as opposed to some other jurisdictions. But what's interesting is while some of the fears never came to pass, for example, huge crime waves related to gambling, the community harms are still existing today. So when it comes to the big challenges with writing this story, I would say the first was that there was no clear answer. I had expected there might be a little bit more clarity and consistency into why we don't have this pushback against online gambling. And it really doesn't exist. Part of this is because in Canada, so few people have really participated in kind of the, activist or sort of community nonprofit space. And for such a short time that there's not really institutional memory, is how I would put it. And there's also not particularly a lot of, research or history related to, kind of anti-gambling movements to really draw from. The other, I think, that is important is that there's this different approach with some groups. So, for example, Grins, which was featured in the article, their focus is more on community harms rather than, say, pushing back against gambling. So we also have to take into account that groups, may have a mission to protect people from gambling harms, but that might not necessarily mean that they are kind of anti-gambling in more of a classical sense. So when it comes to the important takeaways, I think the first is that there's this very clear shift in how we view gambling today. I think that some of the challenges are easy to understand. It's different to protest a physical casino in your community as opposed to an online casino. But there's also this change where people look at gambling as kind of a personal choice. If people want to spend their hard-earned money like that, that's their choice. And if they have a problem with that, again, that's a personal choice, which is an absolutely incorrect, and one might also say, not very community-minded take, I think, to put it generously. But I also think it's important to note, especially because, of Broadview's affiliation with the United Church, there has historically within the United Church been, an anti-gambling movement. And back in the 1990s, there were a lot of op-eds, interviews, research papers done on this. It is interesting to me that among the social justice areas that the church focuses on, some of them are anti-racism, ending poverty, reconciliation, and Indigenous justice. Those are areas that I do think have credible intersections with anti-gambling, as I mentioned in the article. And I think it's important too, because a lot of people, more generally speaking, right, these are areas that they are concerned with and would feel an affinity for, and would want to, help with. And I think that embracing gambling and kind of the questions about whether we need so much of it, how it's regulated, and so forth, is an important part of, making sure that we're helping these groups and we're, pushing forward for a more equitable society. And so I'll hand that over to you, Jocelyn.
Did you set an alarm to make sure you stayed on track? That's great.
I did, yes.
Wow, that's a first. Cecile Fausak has a comment here. She says, thank you, Rob. That was a really great, precise capturing of what you've written and taking it a little further too. So I appreciate that. She says, it's interesting that the main topic of the latest issue of Alberta Views is on gambling as well. The Alberta government itself is addicted to gambling revenues, and so many nonprofit groups are dependent on the money they raise from running casinos. Yeah, there's an economy there. What are your thoughts on that?
I have actually, during my community radio days, I actually did a couple of shifts at a casino so we could earn our share of nonprofit money. And I mean, the one thing that I will say is that at least in that scenario, there is a lot more money going back to the community and groups that need it, which is not present in other parts of Canada. So for example, in my hometown, originally the casino was supposed to fund charities and it was supposed to provide funds to First Nations. And the charitable aspect actually never happened. A few years into it, they just said, you know what, this money's going to the provincial debt instead. And the money received by First Nations has been fairly minimal. So I do think it's a good thing. But again, is it great that there's casinos dotting the landscape in Alberta, mostly patronized by locals, spending their hard-earned money? I would say no. Okay.
And Leaf just noting that the article actually originally ran in the Edmonton Journal and Calgary Herald. Okay, thank you for the source. I'm just wondering, one of the things you talked about is the churches and how, they used to be very engaged with this. They've become less engaged. What do you think about how we can re-engage churches, if that's something that you think needs to happen?
Well, what I think is interesting about it is that churches, just by virtue of the kind of platform they have in society, the membership, just taking this on as an area of concern, I think they're able to do a lot more than most other groups can. And again, I think it comes back to this idea of the community harms of gambling. And like I said, the way that they intersect with other areas that are important. Really, I would say to probably most denominations, regardless of which it is.
Mhm.
And so I think that's something that I would hope we would see, especially now that there's just so much of it ramping up in Canada like never before.
Yeah. Okay, Barry Morris and just Leaf actually wrote that article, so that's great. Thank you, Leaf. He's noticing that the National United Church of Canada staff used to dedicate time to organize and shepherd anti-gambling actions, less so now, if at all, and that's something that really came out in your story. And Leaf is asking if you have a clear idea as to why gambling is so addictive.
Well, I mean, the reason it's so addictive is, I mean, there's a scientific way to go about this, which is a little beyond my remit. But it is worth pointing out that it is now considered, it's in the DSM as gambling disorder now, and it's actually in the updated codes that are being used to track death and illness. Gambling disorder has been added for the first time. So there is like a science element to it, but also there's a lot in game design, especially with video lottery terminals, things like continuous play. Even I've been at the casino, just doing research and noticed that there's buttons to speed up the spins, so you can actually go through it even faster. So there are a few different contributors to that.
Yeah. Peter Wilkins is asking if the Catholic Church is still supporting bingo revenues. Do you know anything about that?
I wouldn't really be able to comment on that. I'm not certain.
Okay, we'll do some research. What's your book about? Can you tell us about what you're working on?
Yeah, so I've been working on a book where I want to look at the Canadian casino industry and just talk a bit about how it has changed over the years from its initial viewpoint, which was that it was supposed to be for tourism and it was supposed to attract people to these different locations, have them bring in money, have them bring in tourism spin-offs. And instead, they've really turned into mostly patronized by locals, taking money out of local economies. And I mean, look, if you look at the casinos in Canada, aside from maybe a handful that might be considered tourism destinations, the rest are not fulfilling that remit. And there's also a lot of conversations that we're not having. We're not doing accurate statistics on things like gambling addiction, gambling related suicide, bankruptcies. Even if you wanted to ask a gambling corporation, the Crown corporations, how much is tourism and how much is locals, these are not things that they know. So I basically want to do a book that's going to kind of chronicle this and give some insights into how the model changed over the years. And hopefully you'll see that in the next probably 2 years or so.
We'll look forward to it. I wonder if you could dive a little deeper too on, there's this idea of the community harms that are being caused, and people most activists are focused on mitigating those community harms. But we're not really talking about gambling itself. Like that is the core problem that we're not addressing. What do you see as the right balance there? Because, you could say, let's abolish gambling, or you could say, where do you stand on that? Do you allow for some? Do you think it's okay in certain circumstances? Where do you fall?
So there is this one line of research called sort of like the ethical casino. And it's something that I'm looking into a bit for one of the chapters of my book. And what I find very interesting about it is it's more or less harm reduction, right? And when you think about it, there is harm reduction for drugs, there's harm reduction for other different medical issues. It's not exactly the same thing, but just for example, does a casino need to be open 24 hours a day? Should you be able to play a video lottery terminal continuously as opposed to having a limit? Can you lower bets? So for example, when I was researching one story, I found that in New Brunswick on the online casino owned by the government, you could spend up to $500 on one spin. Why is that not $2, let's say? So these are all kind of harm reduction strategies that you could build in. And I think that's something that's really both sorely missing in Canadian jurisdictions, but also something that would be very reasonable, I think, to fight for, and that there's a very, I think there's a very compelling case to make for these issues.
Mm-hmm. One harm reduction thing that has happened after you published your piece in print, the Ontario government changed sports betting so that they're now prohibited from using sports stars like Wayne Gretzky to promote, because of course those figures are heroes to young kids. Did that go far enough for you?
No, I mean, I would almost argue, the worst I think has been done in a way, because when these online casinos and sports books launched, out of the gate, there wasn't tight enough regulation. So I think that a lot of harm has already been done. And I'm not so sure that I maybe look at this move as charitably as some others do. Because I'm sure the other thing too, right, is a lot of people, I'm certain, look at this and they say, oh, good, problem's over. They're not using celebrities. It's going to be fine. Kids aren't going to do it, which is a bit short-sighted, I would say, and that we should make sure, like, it's a good thing, it's a positive step, but let's not pretend that it's, a final step, shall we say.
Yeah, and some of the organized groups, that was their only goal, was to make sure that the sports heroes weren't going to be part of the ads anymore. And so are they satisfied, checkbox, they're done, or are they continuing to try to do other kinds of harm reduction with this?
Well, I mean, with the group that I profiled, their remit was really just getting the advertising changes, including the celebrities. So I'm certain that they will be making a retreat, unless maybe they read the article and change their mind. But I'm not entirely certain that they will be sticking around. So again, when I mentioned that there's sort of this in and out, this lack of institutional memory, this is kind of how it happens, that sometimes people have maybe a smaller related issue, and either it gets solved, they could find movement on it and it stops, or I think they get frustrated and just move on.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's, one of the things that makes your work so valuable is that you are looking at all of it through time, and you are providing that, the link from different movements to the next one. Another piece that really interested me and you touched on it a little bit, is how we've shifted from thinking of this gambling as being going from being a vice to a health problem to a matter of personal responsibility. Arguably, we feel the same way about drug use or alcoholism. It's shifted that way. And can you dive into that a bit about why we've changed our perception over time?
So I think one of the biggest reasons that we've changed our perception, and so I guess I should say that I think there's kind of like two issues at play. I think researchers and I think the medical community, I would say they're more serious in their approach to gambling, where, it's now a medical issue, it's an addiction issue. But that's all happening kind of behind the scenes. That's not the sort of thing that the average Canadian is going to read about or necessarily know about. I think the biggest change, realistically, has been that, the sky didn't fall. When casinos came into cities, they didn't fall apart. The crime rate didn't go up dramatically. There weren't a lot of visible issues. And so because of that, I think a lot of people took it for granted that there were actual harms that were caused. But the other, I had this interview with a social worker who had mentioned that one of the big issues is that just in general in society, we have a more neoliberal view where it's personal responsibility. And what's interesting about that is that kind of happened around like the 1980s. So this was just on the cusp of gambling beginning. And I do think that that is probably a very large role, and I think something that's interesting too. I spoke with my mother about this story, and what's interesting is we had talked about how there are a few people sort of within our orbit back home who have had gambling issues. But it's interesting because when you think about it, I think that just about every family in a community, you have family members or friends, coworkers, etc. We all know these people, but I'm not sure that we necessarily view it as, say, something serious that needs to be discussed in the same way as other types of addictions or illnesses. And that, I think, too, is part of the problem. It's just we don't take it seriously enough. We do take for granted what it is.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. We're going to leave it there, Rob. I really appreciate all your insights. And there's one more comment from Vic in the chat if you want to answer that while we move on. But thanks, and all the best with your book. I hope will let us know when it's out. We'd like to take a look at that for sure. So thank you so much for being here.
Wonderful, thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to introduce Ashleigh Rae-Thomas next. Ashleigh Rae is an Afro-Caribbean writer, facilitator, and avid community organizer from Toronto by way of Jamaican roots. In 2022, she was the Canadian Journalism Foundation's Black Women's Fellow at CBC News, and she's previously worked at the Toronto Star and has written for The Walrus and Global News. In the October-November issue, Ashleigh Rae wrote a very personal piece called Reasons to Stay, about the decade that has passed since her suicide attempt. Her piece also incorporates the stories of others who have been through similar experiences. So Ashleigh Rae is joining us from the GO train. She is going to do her very best to hold her camera steady and speak loudly so we can all hear. But she had something come up, but here she is on the GO train to be here with us tonight. So thank you. And welcome, Ashleigh.
Thank you, Jocelyn. Yes, I'm not in anywhere as fancy as Australia. I'm just in Scarborough, I believe. And like I said, I will do my best to enunciate and keep this thing from bouncing around. If you see a fare officer, please tell me. I've paid. Shouldn't be a problem. Yeah, so I just wanted to say before we begin that this is going to be a very heavy topic. Even like interviewing my two people that I wrote about, Lou and Del Canto, and preparing the questions, the whole thing brought up a lot of like negative memories for me. So I can only imagine how you have felt as a reader reading about the worst few days of my life. So I just wanted to let you know, like, if you need to step aside or you need to talk to somebody afterwards, I completely understand it's a heavy topic. So yeah, so what I wanted to say was that 10 years ago, this past February, I tried to end my life. I talk about it sometimes in my regular life, and it isn't something I had written about before. If you knew me well enough, you knew I had struggled with depression, mania, and suicidal ideation for years. The only time we ever hear about suicide, whether it's on the news or wherever, is after it's too late. There's often hand-wringing about not seeing the signs, or worse, having seen the signs but not knowing what to do about it. And then there's material for people who are affected by a loved one's suicide. But what about the people like me who were pushed to the edge and didn't go through with it? When I wrote this essay, I wanted to show that you can be pushed to the brink and still come back. And even if you didn't believe me, here are the accounts of two other people who are saying the same thing. And if you don't believe them, there are the people who have read it and said, you know what, I've had similar thoughts. Or someone who said, I didn't know you went through this, but how can I help? So the two people I speak to about it, Lou and Del Canto, I found out through their stories that I wasn't alone. A lot of people get depressed. Some of them experience suicidal ideation. A smaller group of those actually carry through their attempts. It's all extremely unfortunate, and honestly, I think it could be avoided if we just talked about it more and if it wasn't just such a taboo. Speaking to Lou and Del Canto, I was able to relate to their stories in a way that I hadn't been able to relate to anyone's before. Here were two women who had been through mental health issues almost identical to mine. From being a depressed tween to struggling as a teenager and a young adult, we weren't as alienated as our depression tried to tell us we were. I tried to heal myself in silence by quietly going to therapy, taking medication I didn't really understand at the time. At 18, I was a child, and now I was raising myself as a suicidal child. But now, in writing this essay, I'm healing myself out loud. My friends are reaching out to me saying they didn't know it was so bad, and they are or have gone through something similar. I haven't shared it with family yet. I guess I'm worried about their reaction, but I'm glad I'm healed enough to write about it for Broadview and my friends who follow my career and you guys. So all this to say, I hope you can find healings from the things that you're taught to be ashamed about. I hope you can write or sing or dance or read or just heal out loud. For you, for your own sake, for your friend's sake, and for the little you inside of you that needed a safe adult to listen. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashleigh Rae, and I really want to commend your courage in writing this piece. It can't have been easy to revisit, the time 10 years ago, and to think through and to talk to others also must have been very difficult for you as well. And so I really want to commend you for bringing this topic out for us. Can you share, and I don't want to, if you just want to say no, that's okay, but can you share a bit more about your personal journey leading up to your attempt 10 years ago?
Yeah, I haven't read my piece in a while because it's such a heavy topic, so I'm not sure if I talked about it. But I can remember feeling like the first time something was wrong was when I was 11 or 12. And I remember writing a note in my diary, like being like, leave all my dolls to my cousins and my dresses to so and so. And so now that I'm older, I can understand that that was a suicide note. Um, and I just kind of went in and out of this hopeless place until like I had finally had enough around 18 or 19, and then I tried that thing. And um after that I started to like seriously like try to get help. Um and it's just been a complete 180 since then. Like um even taking my medications every day, like it took me years to get that habit down. It took me years to be like, let me reach out for help before things get bad, um as opposed to doing like damage control after things had gotten bad. Um and so my life is just completely different than it was 10 years ago. And that's what my journey and my article is all about.
Yeah. You talked a bit about how obviously suicide is a taboo subject, but and it's only often talked about after something tragedy has occurred. Why do you think it makes people uncomfortable, and what made you decide to write about it from just bring it out into the open?
Yeah, I think a lot of people feel guilty. A lot of people are like, why didn't I see this coming? Why couldn't I have done something? A lot of people like they internalize it to be like, what could I have? If you know, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. You cut out for a second there, but that's okay.
Okay, no. I think a lot of people feel guilty when they hear that someone is depressed. And I think a lot of the time it boils down to capitalism because we're all so like individualistic in our own lives. We can barely take care of ourselves and our mortgage and rent and kids and taxes and doctor's appointments. We can barely run our own households, much less be there for other people who are going through it. And I think a lot of people feel guilty for that reason. And that makes it taboo. It's like in the West as well, death is a very taboo topic. And like bringing yourself to death is like even more taboo than just passing away from natural causes. So I think there's a lot of factors that make it so taboo, and I think that like writing about it and speaking about it more openly, like I've been told by many people in my life that I should be less open about my mental health, but honestly, I've only seen um the gains, the good part of speaking about my mental health.
Yeah. That's good. Leaf has a question. He says, was there anything you felt brought you through that dark time? A thought of a loved one, a memory? Did you try medication before or after? So a few questions.
Yeah, so with medication, I had a very negligent doctor who I was just like, I'm depressed. And he was like, all right, try this and this. And he never followed up with me. And I was like 16, and my parents didn't really believe in mental health stuff. So I was really doing it on my own. And so if you would ask me 10 years ago if I would be on so much medication as I am now daily, taking it all the time, I would have told you no. But um, a key part of it was having a good doctor, and like online really helped me a lot. Being able to speak to people on the internet who were taking the same medication as me or googling side effects and stuff like that. So a lot of it was having a good doctor and doing my own research, I suppose. And then the first part of the question, what was that? Sorry.
It was there anything you felt brought you through that dark time? Was it a loved one or a memory?
Um, Two things. It's so silly. One, I had a friend who I had just met. He moved from Zambia to Toronto, and I remember being like, has this girl moved halfway across the world to become traumatized by my mental health? And I felt very guilty putting her through what I was putting her through. And so I thought about, and then it started to get bigger, like, okay, these people also love me and these people also love me. And I just have to wait it out. And I was like, okay, let me pick myself up off the floor. And then the other thing, it's very nerdy, but this was just the beginning of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And I really wanted to know how it was going to end. And 10, 10 years later, it has not ended. So here I am.
May they continue to produce movies for many, many decades to come.
Yeah.
Lynette has a question. Lynette, do you want to turn on your unmute? Oh, do you want to? Oh, she's written it. Okay. She's written, is medication a lifelong situation? If not, how and when does the weaning process begin?
Yeah, medication, because I'm bipolar, I have bipolar too. It's going to be lifelong for me. Um, I imagine in the future I may have to switch prescriptions to something else. Um, and it's something that I have to grapple with. I don't like the thought of having to be on medication for the rest of my life. But if I were to look at it in the way that you would look at a physical ailment like diabetes or something, like you will have to take insulin for the rest of your life, and there's nothing taboo or wrong with being diabetic. And so um, why should I assess myself through the lens of, oh, you have to be on meds for the rest of your life? There's nothing wrong when other illnesses do it, so there will be nothing wrong when I do it.
Yeah. Okay. I wondered about if you could elaborate a little bit about the impacts of societal factors like homophobia and racism on mental health struggles and suicidal ideation.
Yeah, the first psychiatrist I ever saw was when I was in university, and he asked me if I was depressed because I was queer. And I was like, I don't understand the correlation. Like, and he was quite queerphobic to me. And it honestly, I could write a whole separate article about trying to seek help while a black depressed immigrant who is also queer. I could write a series about that. Um, yeah, it definitely threw a wrench into the process because I remember seeking help too, and being told after waiting months for an appointment, being told, oh, to stop smoking weed. And while it was true that weed was increasing my anxiety, it wasn't the catch-all. Like, I wasn't depressed because I was smoking weed. I was depressed because of the homophobia and the racism and capitalism and all of that. And the person just assumes that because I'm black and I smoke weed, then that's the source of all my problems. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of factors that played into how bad my mental health got and how it took me so long to get it sorted out.
Yeah. Jillian writes, she says, I give thanks to God that you came through those dark times. Take care of yourself, and I'm grateful you have interest in social interaction and entertainment series. God bless you, is what she wrote.
Thank you.
For people, you talked a bit about how people who are close to somebody who has attempted suicide or commits suicide, and how they feel like they should have seen the signs, or maybe they did see the signs in retrospect and didn't act, or didn't act enough, all those kinds of questions that people ask. What advice can you give if somebody comes to me and says they are feeling depressed, they are thinking about suicide? If somebody comes to any of us in this room and expresses that, what does that person need in that time? What do you advise?
The first thing I'm gonna tell you, what they do not need is for you to call the police. Because that is going to aggravate the situation further. That is going to make the person feel like they are a criminal as opposed to somebody who needs help, or a listening ear, or who needs to take a drive, or who needs a meal. Sorry, the train is coming into Union. So, yeah, I mean, the last thing a suicidal person needs is for you to call the police on them. As for what a person might need, it varies by each situation. But what I can advise you is, like, do not, like, unless the person has like attempted it and they need medical intervention, do not call the police, because they are not trained, they're not equipped to help somebody who is suicidal, and they often just aggravate the situation.
Yep. So don't call the police. Is there something, do you need to get off the train, by the way? I don't want you to
No, it looks like we're stopped between stations for some reason.
Okay. So don't call the police, but what should you do?
Usually, like, for me, when I was feeling that low, I needed time. I needed time for the feeling to pass. I needed to think clearly. I needed a meal. I needed a hug. I needed to be around friends. And and I didn't just need it that night. I needed ongoing care. Like, when you have suicidal ideation, it doesn't just go away, you know. Um, you have, like, people have to, like, keep checking on you and keep caring. And I know it's hard. Like I said, there's all those reasons, like our mortgages and taxes and all those things, so we don't have time. But you really have to make time for your friends who are, like, feeling suicidal, because um it doesn't just pass overnight. It's
Right.
it stays. It's aggressive.
Mhm. Leaf is wondering if you are familiar with mental health crisis teams, where social workers who have training respond with a police officer. I know that they had that in Hamilton, I know, but the police officers sort of kept at bay. What about those teams? Do you feel like those are a possible solution?
Um, I've yet to see them do that in Toronto. Um, I don't know if they have that here. But I honestly think anyone else but the police responding is a good idea, because they're just not equipped. They're not equipped to deal with that. And I could go into a rant about how the police are not equipped to deal with most things, but they are especially not equipped to deal with mental health. And so sending a social worker, or sending a therapist, or, you know, just anyone else, just any other healthcare worker, sending a nurse. Nurses are some of the kindest people I've ever met. As you can imagine, I've had my fair share of ins and outs with hospitals, and it has really been nurses that held me down the whole time. So honestly, anyone but police.
Yeah. Okay. We've heard you loud and clear, and thank you very much. I think you've helped a lot of people in sharing this and writing this, and I'm glad to hear that it's meant people have come forward and known you better, your friends and family, and I really wish you continued good mental health. So thank you very much, and again, thank you for your courage. We're going to, yeah, thank you. We're going to move along to David Kim-Cragg. So David is a United Church minister at St. Matthew's United in Richmond Hill, Ontario. He's also a freelance writer and a sessional lecturer at Emmanuel College in Toronto. His debut book, Water from the Dragon's Well, was published in 2022, and David also holds a PhD in history. In our October-November issue, David Kim-Cragg wrote a feature about the Christian Guardian, Broadview's earliest predecessor publication, and what the editors and writers had to say 194 years ago about relations between the Methodist Church and Indigenous peoples. This is David's second appearance at online reading clubs, and so please join me in welcoming David. You got to unmute yourself.
Right. Thank you. Sorry about that. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you for having me and allowing me to share a bit about the research I did for the latest article for the Broadview. I was thinking as I was preparing for this, my thoughts were very much sharpened by attendance at the Truth and Reconciliation event on Saturday that I attended, and it is with a heavy heart, heavier than might otherwise have been the case, that I'm here before you talking about this research. And I've discovered so many fascinating things digging into the history of the Christian Guardian, and some of the things have helped me to understand the history of the church, of residential schools, of the relationship of the church to Indigenous people better, and to understand some of the decisions that were made. And I think it's always dangerous. Sometimes I find I slip into a dangerous spot where I'm starting to explain the decisions and perhaps even move into a space of excusing the decisions. And really, that's not what this research should be about. It should be coming to terms with really bad things that happen, really harmful decisions, and hopefully helping us to find our way back to a better place. That being said, it's a hard decision, but a hard topic. But the research that I did has just revealed some very, very fascinating people and some very amazing things. And I'd like to talk just briefly about a couple of people and something else that I thought was very very interesting for me as I studied. So the first person I want to talk about is Nani. Her indigenous name was Nanebawekwe, and her English name is Catherine Sutton. And she has just a fascinating story, which the article that was published just recently, I just touched the surface of. Her roots go right back to one of the first and most one of the strongest Indigenous Methodist leaders in Upper Canada. His name was Kakewaquanabi, or Peter Jones. She was a niece to Peter Jones, Kakewaquanabi, but was really raised by him, and to the point where Peter actually took her to see the Queen. I'm not sure that she actually got an audience with the Queen, but when Kakewaquanabi traveled to England on one of his missions to address the situation of Indigenous people in Upper Canada, he brought Nani with him, and she had all this experience of going to England and that whole adventure, and but she remained very, very committed to her Indigenous roots, although she was given all kinds of opportunities that many non-Indigenous people didn't have in Upper Canada. She really was a committed member of her community, which was first the Mississaugas of the Credit, And then later she moved up to what is now the Bruce Peninsula and was associated with the Nawash community there, and really strongly identified with them as well. So the story about her losing her status as an Indigenous person and the rights that came with that status, the acknowledgement of herself as an Indigenous person, and the land that was attached, which was given to her as being part of that community, was really, really tragic and heart-wrenching to learn about. The other person that I wanted to talk about is this fascinating person that I got to know, ironically, studying about the Christian Guardian. This is the editor of the Toronto Globe, the parent company of today's Globe and Mail, George Brown. Now, so as I dug into this story about the Christian Guardian at the time of Confederation, this other person came to the fore, this George Brown, and quite a fascinating person, which helped me to see the Christian Guardian and what it was doing in a bit of relief. So George Brown, is a father of Confederation, a strong advocate for the new country of Canada, was a remarkable person and is really remembered in the Black community, Canadian Black community, as an advocate for Black rights within Canada West, within the new country of Canada. But what's fascinating is that nevertheless, even though he had this strong advocacy for the Black community, he was absolutely terrible when it came to Indigenous people. And he viewed them, and it printed to the effect that they were just an obstacle, a roadblock on the way to civilization and to development. And his paper hounded Nani as she made her way to see the Queen in England to present her case, and said all kinds of horrible things about her. So it was really fascinating to see that side of George Brown and the Globe. Learn both those sides and what a complex history our country has. And so the third thing that that really came and hit home while I was working on this particular article was just the way that Canada in its infancy was a very vulnerable, fragile idea. And there was no guarantee at the beginning of the country that it was going to survive more than a decade. And I think this anxiety had a lot to do the need to kind of prove its strength, and to show and to compete against the United States, and to establish a little independence from Great Britain, led to kind of a general sweeping of Indigenous people, their concerns, the whole history, the relationship under the rug, and helping to just hide that away from the general gaze of it. The Christian Guardian was also very much swept away in that general anxiety for the new country. And so I guess those are the things that I really took away from my research, and I'll pause there.
Okay, thank you. That's great, David. And for those who don't know, David, we know that he wrote in the October-November issue, but if you haven't seen it, he's also just published on Friday on our website only to start. We'll hopefully put it in print later. A piece about the Christian Guardian around the time of Confederation. So we now have an interesting comparison between the 1820s and 30s when we started this publication, and then the 1860s, 70s era. Can you comment a bit about, just in broad terms, there's a real change in that 40-year period between 1829, when this publication started, and the 18, like how would you describe those key changes between those two time periods, 40 years of this publication?
Yeah, so one of the big changes is in the position of Indigenous people, both within the church and within Canada. At the beginning of in 1829, 1830, the time that the Christian Guardian got started, there were more Indigenous people in the Methodist Episcopal Church as a percentage of the membership than there were Indigenous people compared to non-Indigenous people in Upper Canada. So Indigenous people had a real strong presence in the Christian Guardian at that time, and over the next 40 years, their position both in the Christian Guardian, the Methodist Church, and in Canada diminished significantly on a number basis. So the number of Indigenous people in Canada continued to decline until the early 1900s. And while the number of settlers increased and increased, so their position within Canada as a proportion of the population significantly declined. And then the next thing that happened is that the momentum for Indigenous people joining the Methodist Church really fell off in the 1840s. And so by the time of Confederation, Indigenous people weren't quite the enthusiastic new converts that they had been. So that's another element of the change that took place in those 40 years between the beginning of the Guardian and Confederation.
We're just through with another, well, I guess this was the third National Day of Truth and Reconciliation that was on Saturday. How do you feel like this historical record and going through all these, old papers and looking at this particular question about the relationship between Methodist Church as expressed in the Christian Guardian and Indigenous people, how do you think this is contributing to both truth and reconciliation, or do you?
Well, again, I think in order to really get at the heart of what happened, we have to go back into the past and try to see things from the perspective of the folks that lived those early decisions that led to the residential schools. I mean, it's not just the residential schools, of course, it's the whole way that treaties were dismissed and Indigenous people marginalized economically and socially from the Canadian population. But learning the history is just so important, and we can take other people's word for it, or we can dig into it ourselves and try and understand it for ourselves. And I really think it behooves us to do our own research as the United Church of Canada, as members of the United Church of Canada, as Canadian citizens, do as much reading as we can to try and figure out what happened. And fortunately for me, I mean, I feel very blessed that involves going back to some of the original documents and some of the original witnesses to some of the pivotal events, and really looking firsthand at that. It's been helpful for me and to some degree healing.
That's great. Well, it's been healing to edit your pieces and to share them with readers, and you're doing a lot of that reading on our behalf and parsing out the pieces that we really need to understand and highlighting those for all of us. So thank you for your excellent work on that. I'm just going to wrap us up, but David, if you can, and our other guests, if you have a few minutes to stay afterwards and chat with people a bit more informally, I'd appreciate that. I'm sure there are other questions that people are just mulling right now. But just to officially wrap up, thank you so much to everybody for being here tonight, and especially to Rob and Ashleigh, Rae, and David, who volunteered their time to make this event possible. And we're so grateful to you. Tomorrow we'll be sending you a short survey by email so you can share your thoughts with us about the event. And as you know, this is a free event, but it does cost us $3,000 per year for the Zoom plan that can handle a group of this size. So if you're already a donor to Broadview, I thank you so much. Your donations help us continue to feature exceptional writers and journalists like Rob Csernyik, Ashleigh Rae-Thomas, and David Kim-Cragg. If you're not a donor, please consider making a donation for tonight's event. And Sharon will post a link for the donations in the chat. I see she already has. And we'll also have a link in tomorrow's survey. Broadview's reading clubs exist across Canada. If you're interested in joining a local club or starting one of your own, please check out our information pages at broadview.org/reading clubs. And if you have a club that's not listed here, please let us know. We can share spread the word. So as I mentioned, we'll be staying for a little informal coffee hour with our guests to continue chatting. But if you need to be on your way, thank you again for being here, and be well. We will see you back here for our next reading club, which is on December 4th at 7 p.m. Eastern. And Alana Mitchell will be our host. And happy Thanksgiving to everybody. David, I have another quick question for you about your methodology, because I've seen there's online, you can get the Christian Guardian online. It's the United Church Archives has scanned in the whole thing, and it goes from 1829 to 1925. And so you are plowing through that, but that's a lot of grainy, hard to read. How do you approach this?
Well, there's two steps. One is a lot of reading of secondary materials, so people who've already researched the Christian Guardian and what they've come up with, and sometimes they'll point me to very important articles, they'll do the work for me, and so that's one step. And then the next step is just to go through the Guardian and just read and read and read. I mean, there's just tons there. Sometimes it makes my eyes cross. Sometimes I come across the most, the funniest, the best stuff, like really important historical things, and also the funniest little stories. Like there was a debate whether in some churches whether women should skate in the Methodist Church, if the religion allowed women to skate, and whether men should have beards. And basically to answer your question, I mean, it's just a lot of reading. You just have to go through as much as possible, try to pinpoint the important dates and zoom in there and read and read.
Yeah. Jillian, you have your hand up. Are you able to unmute yourself, Jillian?
Okay, sorry.
There you are. Okay.
I'm Gillian McLean, and
Gillian,
I just wanted to say greetings to David Kim-Cragg. I was at St. Matthew's Church, and when it was a little white clapboard church in Richmond Hill, and I was in the choir at 4 years old. So I just wanted to let you know that I was a congregant many years ago. And I remember when the existing building was built after they pulled down the little white clapboard church. I just wanted to let you know that. And thank you for your work.
Thank you, Jillian.
Vic Weeb, jump on in.
Hi, David. We know each other from St. Andrews College days, but anyway,
Nice
I wondered in your research of the early papers, did you find language that was so offensive as we see from politicians of the day? They're like, comments about having to take the kids away from their families so they wouldn't grow up as to be savages like their parents, and that kind of terminology. Did you find that in the magazine that kind of reflected it all?
So one of the things that I found, Vic, there's no question that there was a terrible there's some terrible stereotypes spinning in the heads of the early Methodists, but there was also a real openness to Indigenous culture, and in the sense that, well, I should say there was an openness to Indigenous leadership, and to the point that Indigenous people were given a significant voice within the early Christian Guardian. So you have in the first year of the Christian Guardian, these two kind of parallel voices. One is the Indigenous and one is the settler, and you can really tell who's speaking when you read the words. There was no concept of taking Indigenous children away from the parents at the time. They were trying to educate. They were trying to civilize. That this was the settler way of thinking. The Indigenous way of thinking was equipping Indigenous kids to be able to survive in this new world with the settlers. In the settler mind, it was kind of probably the spinning was make them become more like us. That wasn't the way the Indigenous people were thinking, and the settler churches were funding schools where Indigenous kids were learning both in English and in Anishinaabe. So bilingual education. So the really sad stuff about killing the Indian and the child, that stuff, and then the terrible Indian Act and the residential school system, that came decades later. So it's not, you don't find it in the same way in the early Christian Guardian.
Okay, thanks. And I just wondered where those leaders of the day got that kind of impression that, because we struggle with some of those leaders were also prominent leaders of the church.
Yes.
Yeah.
Dale has a question. Go ahead, Dale. You take yourself off mute.
Yes, good evening. Thank you, David, for doing some of this research and getting us better attuned to some of the early thinking. And I'm the fifth generation of young family who were engaged in outreach members. How do I put it? I don't know. I can't use their language, and I don't know how to put it in our language. But they were engaged in missions to the First Nations people, the Indian people. William Young was ordained in 1937, and down in the 1837, and down towards Hay Bay. Actually, he preached in Hay Bay for a while in his internship, and they were all, as you say, there were more Methodists. There were First Nations, I guess. They were all involved in missions and working with First Nations people. And all of this stuff that's come out in the last 10, 15 years is really troubling me because I don't know where I fit anymore. This is part of our family heritage of connection to the First Nations people. I served on Christian Island in the 80s. I was present at the apology with the First Nations people. I attended there with them. So I'm still trying to figure out how to respond to some of the need for reconciliation when I guess I feel a kinship to First Nations people that I've never been able to bring it together with what's going on now. And when I hear some of the stories, I get, that's awful. What happened to so many people? So I don't know where we can go with this kind of conversation, but I'm just trying to make some sense of it for myself and learn more about what happened and really what was going on in the era from 1868, 1867, 1868, when Edgerton Ryerson Young went to Norway House, or near Norway House, particularly, and I read some of his books and some of his language about the First Nations people. It's quite derogatory in some ways, and yet he gave his life to them. He gave his heart to them. He gave everything, and thinking that he was doing the right thing. So how do we bring all this together?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't catch your first name.
My name is Dale.
Dale. Thanks, Dale. I really feel in many ways we're on a similar journey. And so I wish you all the best. And, I hope you wish me the best too. We'll just keep learning as much as we can, listening as much as we can. And hopefully, meeting and engaging more Indigenous friends. I found that to be the most, beyond the research, being able to have Indigenous friends to talk to and to listen to has really helped me in a way to make sense and of what is being said now, and or at least assure me that relationships of genuine love and sincerity are not for nothing.
Yeah, thank you. And when I was ordained in 1988, they were just starting to move towards trying to get more First Nations, Native people in Native ministry. And I was let go. I was there as a student, and they decided not to hire me again for another year because they wanted to have Indian. At least the church people told them that they wouldn't have a Native minister as long as they kept having Dale there. But my heart was there. And nobody can see that Indian part of my heart.
I wonder if Cecile, sorry Dale to interrupt, but Cecile Fausak is here, and she's former General Counsel Liaison Minister for Residential Schools. I wonder, Cecile, if you've written a lovely comment here. I wonder if you want to just share a bit about
Sure.
thoughts, and if you're willing to speak.
Sure. Thank you for that. And I have followed David's stories with a lot of interest. I think it's so important for us to know the truth of what was said and done in the past. And I just really appreciate the sensitivity that you come with, David. And you've had a sensitivity reader too, which I find interesting, and kind of wondering what that has led to, the kinds of changes that might have been made in the story from that reading.
Thank you. It's been the best thing for me. I've asked others besides the sensitivity reader, and have interviewed Indigenous people as well, but the sensitivity reader has really picked up some wonderful things, and caught me. One of the things that I remember about my article about the origin of residential schools in the United Church of Canada, I had phrased it like something like, the United Church didn't get into residential schools, it inherited residential schools. And the sensitivity reader pointed out that seems to be like you're eliding responsibility here. Like the United Church didn't really have responsibility for what was happening. They just kind of were shouldered with it later, and said, it's probably more appropriate to say absorbed or something like that. The United Church absorbed residential schools, and to the point that they really became a part of the United Church. That was one example. The latest article that I wrote, the sensitivity reader, was consistently pointing out that when I introduce an Indigenous person, it's important to say where that Indigenous person is from and who their community was. And that's something that I don't think, you don't see that in your usual newspaper articles. When somebody gets introduced as a minister of so-and-so or a CEO of but not where they're from, who their community is. That is important information to include in the story when you're talking about Indigenous folks especially, but probably it's not a bad thing to consider about all of us, where we're from, who our people are, what kind of community are we coming out of. So these are some of the lessons that I've learned from our sensitivity writer or reader.
Yeah, and her name is Vanessa Kennedy, and she's a consultant, and we've hired her because obviously David is Caucasian and comes from a mindset, and so we needed somebody who's Indigenous and trained in this kind of careful reading to help us make sure that those stories are produced really as best as we can, and to tell the story as well as we can. So yeah. I wanted to point out also at the bottom of the story, it mentions that John and Lillian Perigo funded David's work, and John is here tonight. And so I just wanted to thank John. And I don't know, John, you haven't met David except here, and David, please meet John. But John has and Lillian both have a deep care for Indigenous people, and so when we proposed to John if he would be willing to help fund David's work, he was on board. And so we're very thankful to John for that as well. Lynette. Okay, Lynette says, I understand the aspect of truth and hope we continue to work toward truth. I'm concerned about the reconciliation aspect. What can we make gains here? What about language and land appropriation? Sorry, there's a bit of a typo there. I think she meant appropriation.
Well, that's a great question, and I don't pretend to be any expert on the subject, but I am conscious that the reason why this history is so important is because in the present day context, the difference between the condition of Indigenous people and relative to non-Indigenous people is so strikingly unjust. So really the whole point of this exercise, and the reason why we're having this conversation, is to make things better. There shouldn't be Indigenous communities that don't have clean drinking water, and Indigenous children should not represent 57% of the kids in foster care, and some incredible percentage of people in federal institutions, prisons, and the like. This is just wrong, and so we really need to work hard. The history is the truth is just a piece of it, but it's really the reconciliation where the rubber hits the road. That's where, and reconciliation is not just happy clappy, let's wear orange shirts and go to Truth and Reconciliation Day events. It's really about making things better and fairer for all Canadians. That's my 2 cents.
Okay. A few comments there. Indigenous people represent 8% of Edmonton's population, but 58% of the homeless population in the city. That's very stark. And Gillian says maybe you should be studying about survivor guilt, so that many people are suffering from. Dwelling on the dead and gone is not productive. We do not pray for the dead, but to live in the here and now. All my life I've heard about the water problems. Fix it. Put your energy into that. Yeah. Any other comments? And I also, Rob is still here. our first guest of the evening is also still here. If anybody has any additional thoughts they want to share about what we can do with gambling and sports betting and the problem that that's creating as well in many lives and families. Any other thoughts tonight? Rob, there's a question there. Do you have knowledge about Gamblers Anonymous?
Yes, I mean, I do. I'm currently working on a story for Chatelaine about women's gambling, and an interesting little preview is that there's actually a lot of online groups now that are a bit more ad hoc, where people in recovery are sort of taking recovery into their own hands. I know that Gamblers Anonymous is very helpful for some, but for others, it's just, it's a very prescribed program. It has kind of its, 12 steps, etc. And I know it does work for some people, and I know that it doesn't for others. I also know that in Canada, that tends to be one of the first places you're suggested to go. And I do wonder sometimes if perhaps the provinces abdicate a little bit of their responsibility when it comes to gambling addiction, because they think they can just send people to these groups just because they already exist and have kind of a proven method.
Is gambling growing among women? I often associate it more with men for some reason. I'm just telling you my own stereotypes and bias. I'm not sure where I got that from.
Yeah, so I mean, the key thing about it is that for many years, it's always stereotypically been considered kind of a male domain. But actually, in Sweden recently, for the first time, women, female gambling addicts, I should say, overtook male gambling addicts as the majority. And we're actually seeing very big increases, especially with online. So this is something in Canada right now that we need to watch for. And what is pretty wild, like I've mentioned before, there's just so much we don't talk about gambling. When I was doing my research for the story, I even tried to find women who had spoken out in media, and I could only find one. For example, there was a story in Saskatchewan. They spoke with several gambling addicts. They were all men. So, when you think about, just how if you think about the different threads of conversation I've talked about today, there's just so many data gaps right now on so many just critical areas of gambling. And it's quite honestly, it's just astonishing to think about. And I mean, that's one reason why it's so exciting, that Broadview took on this story, because, it really does help spread that conversation and have that conversation. And I think that's a big part of what we're missing, and luckily, I have the piece coming out with Chatelaine. I'm also a Missioner Deacon Investigative Fellow working on a story for the Walrus about gambling suicides. So there will, within the next, let's say the next 8 to 9 months, be some more food for thought on the subject, and hopefully some new conversations.
When's your Chatelaine article coming out? Do you know?
We're aiming for November, December.
Okay, great. Murray has a comment here. Rob, we have a presentation a number of years ago from the general manager of the Weston Fair in London, who said that a portion of the proceeds were given to Western Fair and other organizations. Recently, I believe that this was discontinued, which was sad to see. Having said that, I was also involved in a skating club, and a significant portion of our annual costs were funded by local bingo halls. which reduce the cost to the parents, the skaters. Yeah, it's again that, you know, we're talking about that. Look, we're all benefiting from it in Ontario, or in other provinces. It's, you know, it's like another tax. We're all healthcare, education, everything's being paid for.
Well, I mean, this is sort of the challenge, right? And this is where I might disagree with Murray on this point, is that sure, it is being subsidized, but in some cases that might be subsidized by people who, you know, are seniors spending their pension check because they think they're going to win big on bingo, or sometimes that money going into the general province fund is disproportionately coming from people who have a gambling addiction. Because there are uses of the money that can be positive. I'd also argue, so for example, in Nova Scotia, I know that we don't actually track where the money goes. It goes into the general fund. So, I mean, in theory, they could say, well, that goes to education, but that could also go to expensive dinners when people travel, you know. It's just like when you're a teenager or a college student and, you know, you get $50 from your grandparents, you know, well, did you spend that going out to party or did you spend that on groceries? You know, you can sort of put that into, when it's put into a general fund, you can sort of fudge where it goes. And I mean, the other issue that really is important too is that a disproportionate amount of these funds, like we just don't really know where it goes. We hear about it because we also have to question, where are we hearing about this? You know, I had someone write to me after an article I wrote about just all the good that gambling money does for PEI. He's like, you need to look into this because they do so many good things here. But it's just the same old PR spin, you know, we help fund X and Y and Z. And it was just shocking to me that this person had believed somehow that the Atlantic Lotto Corporation, which operates in 4 provinces, generally, you know, the same sort of scenario in each, was somehow perhaps, you know, because the article was about Nova Scotia, you know, that maybe it wasn't doing a great job in Nova Scotia, but in PEI, it was really doing something else. And I'll be honest, that gave me a bit of a chill because it really did show the power of kind of the conversation when it is led by the people involved in it. When you have journalists and others who are critical, then it expands a lot more.
Rob, do you ever gamble? Do you buy a lottery ticket, a scratch ticket, anything?
No. I'll be quite honest. Ever since I started doing this work, I do, you know, go to casinos and that sometimes, more kind of, I guess, to inform my reporting. You know, like you do have to actually play the machines to understand how things work and sort of observe. But I'll give an example here. So I was in Las Vegas on a 2-week fellowship recently, and I was doing research for my book. And one of the things that was sort of funny was I decided to play some roulette because statistically roulette has more kind of realistic odds than slot machines because it's not as pre-programmed. So I'm playing that, and I had put in $100, not intending to lose $100, but I put in $100. And I played for a couple of hours just because, you know, they bring you a free beer every once in a while. And I was talking to the people next to me. But after a couple of hours, I think I was up $5. And I remember thinking at the end of this, like, I spent all this time. And I mean, like, yeah, I had some fun, but for $5, and I have seen people at casinos, you know, with the machine, like going into huge deficits. I played roulette another time, and there was a lady next to me, and you would see the amount of money she was spending go from like, you know, 250 up down to 100 and then up to 300 and all this. And it's just, it really can be dangerous if you're not careful with this. You know, like there's a big difference between, say, spending, you know, $20 because you want to have fun and you're doing it instead of going to a movie, and, you know, between compulsive gambling. And that's also a distinction sometimes I don't think we draw enough.
I'm just imagining you at the roulette table taking notes for your next book or your next article. And what got you interested in this topic in the first place?
It's kind of funny because so I grew up in Sydney, Nova Scotia, and when I was a little kid, I used to always read my mom's chatelaine. So I was always reading. It's funny. I was always reading the long form stories. So just about issues that when I'm like a 10-year-old boy, like completely over my head. But anyway, this one month I remember I would have been I think 11 years old, and it said something on the cover like when the casino came to town, and I ended up just saying to myself, wouldn't it be weird if it's a casino here in Sydney? I opened it up, and lo and behold, there was a story on the Sydney casino, and it talked about a lot of the ills that were happening there. Everything from people spending their pension checks to just the fact that the city at the point was in economic decline. Does there really need to be a casino when there's so many people unemployed, underemployed? And what ended up happening was I had that in the back of my mind when I became a journalist, as an adult. And I said to myself, I wonder if anyone's ever looked into what happened, because I know that around the time it started, there was thoughts, even printed in places like Maclean's and Chatelaine, that casino might not survive. It might have been a poor business decision, but it was still there. And so I started going through newspaper archives, and I realized nobody has really assessed what happened. We haven't looked at, was it as profitable as we planned? Were there enough tourists? Have we retained the jobs we were supposed to? Has it developed the community economically in the way it was supposed to? And essentially, no, none of that was true. And from there, I just started seeing other little wisps of ideas that I found very interesting. And that's why I've kept on it. And I think the other element, too, is just from a personal level. It's just, it's an interesting topic because it combines everything from business to politics to economic development to health. Like there's a very wide world within gambling to cover. And when you're one of the few people, if not the only, really covering it on a dedicated basis in Canada, there's lots of opportunities to do so.
It's like your own personal beat in Canada. That's great. Yeah. Well, any other final thoughts from anyone before I wrap us up? We're getting close to almost at 8:30 here. Well, again, thanks to everyone who decided to stay for the additional conversation, the bonus conversation. And especially, again, David and Rob, thanks so much for your time. This has been a really special night. And I've learned a lot. Hope everybody here has also learned a lot and lots to chew on as we go about the rest of our evening. So thank you so much. And yeah, take care. And again, happy Thanksgiving.